Let's imagine a little scenario. You are in combat. The classes and the monsters don't matter, but let's say there's 5 baddies and there are 3 of you. Here's the setup. Your barbarian is engaged with 1 goblin, while your paladin is engaged with another 2. There's a goblin mage firing spells from afar, while you, the party's own spellcaster, are likely about to be attacked by an oncoming goblin. Now, there's a lot of ways that this can play out within a single turn, depending on the turn order, but let's assume that you are going last. On the table, there's a battle raging, but at the table, things are moving a little slow. The Paladin's player is thinking about which goblin to attack and looking over their spell list. The Barbarian player is texting their significant other, and you are working on your strategy for the upcoming Dice Stacking National Championship. And while all of you wait for the Paladin to make their first move, you can see that the DM is becoming frustrated. This is taking longer than he expected. Not only is the Paladin not sure what they want to do on their turn, the other players aren't preparing for their turns at all, and it's about this time that you'll likely hear my least favorite adage from a frustrated DM. You should be thinking about what you're going to do on your turn. I'll front with you on the topic of this video. I've always resented this quote-unquote advice from DMs when I hear it in its various forms, because whenever I've wanted to say this as a DM, I find that usually what I want to say is, can you guys decide quicker, or can you guys pay attention? And then ultimately what I say is just a means to express what I mean, which is, this is taking too long. Look, let's be honest, no matter the amount of preparation, the experience of the players, or the length of your turn timers, there's a fair amount of downtime in every combat scenario. Well, for everyone other than the DM. I think sometimes it's a grass is greener scenario that leads to these types of things, where you see your players utilizing their downtime in, let's say, less than efficient ways, and so when they seem unprepared for their turn, it gets frustrating. Those minutes you spent texting could have been utilized deciding which of the 2 goblins you want to hit. I'm gonna go with this one, by the way. But the more that I think about this statement, the less useful I think it really is. First off, this advice often feels like the DM is telling you to do this. Decide what you want to do before your turn. And that just isn't feasible. Think of the options that you have at your disposal. Even within the general combat actions, there are racial abilities, feat abilities, spells if you're insane and picked a spellcaster, and even if you can decide what to do before your turn comes, the targets or circumstances of your choice are always subject to change, sometimes right before your turn. Your target could die, attack you, attack an ally, run away, activate a special ability, heal, down an ally, down 2 allies. I mean, hell, right before the end of your turn, a creature can use a legendary action and completely shake up the battlefield. All of which could disrupt what you had intended to do on your turn. And what do you do then? Well, it's back to that long list of options at your disposal to see how to react to the situation that you find yourself in at the beginning of your turn, and what certainly isn't helpful is the DM looking at you like, I told you to be prepared. Combat, for as long as it may take, is still highly involved. It's arguably the most involved and most difficult part of the game. That is due, in no small part, to the dynamic nature of most combats, and sure, not every choice will be complicated. Sometimes everyone's choice will just be damage the big monster. But in some cases, combat can be extremely complicated. Beyond the things I've already mentioned, combat can be further complicated when you consider things like moral considerations, political consequences, environmental factors, or props. In a lot of ways, you aren't able to fully consider your options until your turn begins. Things are always subject to change, and honestly, this advice doesn't change that. So where does that leave us? All of this isn't to say that active listening isn't important. It is. And in a perfect world, everyone would be engaged at all points, and combat would play out in a way that's both tense and challenging for everyone, but we have to think practically. And I don't mean to suggest that DMs are always wrong. Of course, players are often inefficient and often get distracted. But you must be honest and practical about what it is that you want to address. Let's take phones for example. Personally, players on their phones really irks me. DMs spend a lot of time planning out and preparing their games. I spend a lot of time planning and preparing. and seeing players on their phones almost feels like they're taking your hard work for granted. Even if they don't mean to, it can hurt my feelings, it can be frustrating. But I'm not going to pretend like 5 minutes of texting is going to drastically alter the speed at which my players make their combat decisions. Given everything that I said above, I don't think it'll affect anything at all. But in my mind, phones at the table is still worth addressing at session 0, if only to tell my players how I feel about them. If your combats are taking too long, if you're getting frustrated, if you are not having fun as a DM, I would urge you to think critically about why that is. It's incumbent on you as the DM to avoid half measures, and while it may be the right answer in some scenarios, often I think that this instruction is a half measure. If you find yourself constantly reminding your players to think about or plan their turns in advance, I would suggest that you think about why that is. If the problem is chronic, a simple reminder is probably not going to fix things. Consider talking to your players about how to fix things and avoid making decisions like turn timers without consulting with your players about how to best fix the problem. Consider that maybe the issue is the way that you're feeling about how combat is going. I think that, as in most of my videos, communication is really the key here, because ultimately, there is a bit of wisdom in this. Namely, that it's only through proper planning that you'll be able to succeed.